I'm very interested in some of the research that have been doing for the past few years and ongoing in terms of looking at this interface between metabolism and specifically breast cancer risk and breast cancer, increased breast cancer recurrence. So I know when I think, of lifestyle factors that are modifiable and that are actually known to increase breast cancer risk, obesity comes to mind.
Sure. Obesity is definitely one of the big ones, and also physical activity. More recently, we've become aware of the importance of physical activity. What's been harder for us to identify is exact types of foods that could reduce risk. And in fact, we've not really had a lot of success in identifying individual foods or individual nutrients that seem to make a difference. Although I think there's more acceptance now of the idea that an entire dietary pattern, let's say the Mediterranean dietary pattern, may influence risk over decades. So I would say those are probably the top concerns, is diet quality, obesity, physical activity. Those are the things, and even tobacco can increases breast cancer risk. Mm-hmm. So there's many things individual women can do to reduce their risk.
I was reading, I think maybe the American Cancer Association had published some statistics on how obesity can increase the risk of breast cancer by twofold, mm-hmm. and also specifically looking at some of the mechanisms by which obesity can increase breast cancer risk. There were a variety of them, including increased inflammation, increased hormone, so estrogen, and also increased fasting insulin levels. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think we've known for a long time about sex hormones, in particular estrogen, as a risk factor, because some of our first really successful drugs were based on blocking the action of estrogen. Estrogen is a growth factor, so it appears if we can block that, it can reduce your risk or reduce your risk of recurrence. And we have some pretty effective drugs that have made a big difference. It's more recently that we've realized that other growth factors have the same type of impact. And it's almost common sense. If estrogen is a growth factor and that increases growth rates of tumors, well, what about insulin? It's also a growth factor. It encourages metabolism. So we do believe that perhaps high levels of circulating insulin may be really central to the whole process of developing breast cancer and promoting its growth. And high levels of insulin are definitely found in women who are overweight, if you're less physically active, and then, of course, among diabetics, often have high circulating levels of insulin. So we are becoming more aware that that may be kind of a common road where many different syndromes lead to the increased risk of breast cancer.
And so insulin, so you mentioned that people that are overweight and people that are obese have higher circulating insulin levels. They also have higher circulating estrogen levels, right? So does fat can secrete, am I right? Fat can secrete estrogen, or is that something?
Fat can, yes. So that's pretty central. And then what we also know is that people who have high levels of insulin have lower levels of serum hormone binding globulin, something called SHBG, which binds estrogen, so it can prevent it from being active. So they seem to be related. They're not just two independent pathways. They actually play off each other.
And you brought up something that was very, I think, important, and that is you said that these growth factors, they promote the growth of tumor cells, of cancer cells. These are...
Right. That's in a very general way.
Right. Yeah, so you're something's causing the initial damage, the cells become damaged, and we have a lot of mechanisms inherent in our cells that can sense damage and say, well, okay, I'm going to die. I'm going to kill myself because if I don't, it may potentially lead to a cancer cell. Right. But if you have all these growth signaling factors happening in the presence of that damage, it's sort of saying, hey, no, keep going, keep growing, don't die, grow, grow, grow.
Yes.
And so that's sort of like, I think, the combination between things that are causing the damage, which possibly high inflammation, so obesity also is associated with high inflammation, and then in the combination of the inflammation and the high insulin, the high insulin-like growth factor, the high estrogen. It's sort of like this detrimental combination of damage and growth signals to allow them to survive. You also mentioned the serum binding hormone, that
serum hormone binding globulin.
Yeah, that's
SHBG.
Thank you. and you mentioned that binds estrogen and sort of makes it inactive from going to activate, I guess, in breast tissue or whatever tissues. What about also the insulin? So I mentioned the insulin-like growth factor pathway, which is separate, but from insulin, they're two separate growth factors, but they're also very interconnected.
Yeah, I think the data on insulin-like growth factor is a little less consistent and a little harder for us to understand. So we think it's also playing a role, but studies have been, some studies have found it to be a risk factor and other studies haven't. And you're talking about circulating levels, I'm sure, because it's also very complex because there's receptors for these things on the cells that may also play in.
Right.
So it's a very complex system, which is why we've had such a hard time coming up with cures. Is because there's lots of redundancies and one system affects another system. And so just finding like that magic pill that can turn off all these different related pathways is virtually impossible. There's so many workarounds for our body. Our body is incredibly resourceful.
Right. So these three factors that are known, the high fasting insulin, the high free estrogen, and the high inflammatory markers. So as measured by certain biomarkers like C-reactive protein.
Right.
So these are all associated with, in some cases, even 2 to 3-fold increased risk.
Yeah, it's definitely twofold and maybe a little bit more. I think that's generally what the metric we use. Each one of them increases the risk individually by twofold. Combination-wise, we don't know. It's probably not quite additive, but they still would have a combined effect too. That's reason to look at all these different pathways. But those are definitely the three major metabolic pathways that we think feed into having kind of fertile soil so that when these DNA changes happen, they're in a place where they're kind of like fertile soil, more likely to go to an invasive tumor type.